G'day legends, so it's been a pretty wild weekend in the MMA world, and this video is going to be about, is the UFC title actually a joke? Now, why are we talking about this? Because this weekend we just had Israel Adesanya fight for a UFC belt after yet another title shot without fighting a single contender. In the same weekend, we have had conversations about Alex Pereira fighting Khalil Roundtree, and of course, coming up in the future, we have Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic. All of this is happening on the backdrop of the year that seems to be the year of undeserved title shots. So I thought we could settle this once and for all. There is this feeling out there that the UFC belt has become a joke ever since we merged with the WWE and became the TKO group. And I am going to look at every single male UFC title shot since Dana White and, was it Vince McMahon? I don't know. I don't follow the WWE. Who cares? Since Dana White rung the bell at the New York Stock Exchange in September of 2023, and tally them up. And we will figure out, now that the UFC is under the banner of the TKO group, is the majority of UFC title shots deserved or a joke? And what I mean by this is, the idea of the UFC is they do not manipulate things. This is the package that we are sold to us, right? This is not my opinion on it. My opinion on it is it's a sports entertainment company. If you want a meritocracy, go watch the PFL. But it is packaged to us that it is the best fight the best. And the UFC is a platform that is there to amplify the stories of the fighters and may the best man win. That is what the package that is being sold to us is. Yet we all know there is this feeling out there that what is actually getting sold to us is sports entertainment. And has it started to lean more on the entertainment side? Is the UFC now picking and choosing their title shots depending on what will be the most entertaining or most profitable thing? Giving us a sort of WWE feel in the UFC where the fights are real, but the circumstances or the opportunities for certain fighters are certainly getting more and more put together by the UFC, or are we allowing the spirit of competition to actually play out and the UFC is just signal boosting that story of the fighters? So let's get right into it, shall we? The very first title fight that happened after Dana White rang the bell and became the TKO group officially on the New York Stock Exchange was UFC 293, where it was Israel Adesanya versus Sean Strickland. That was not the right title fight that should have happened. Now, yes, Israel Adesanya called for Sean Strickland, but the UFC picked Sean Strickland over Jared Cannonier. Jared Cannonier was the backup fighter and should have been fighting for that belt. But as we all know, their first fight, Jared Cannonier and Israel Adesanya, was incredibly boring, and who the hell would want to go and watch that? So I don't blame the UFC for making this call and going with Israel Adesanya and picking out Sean Strickland when Dricus du Plessis didn't want to step in there. But it should have been Jared Cannonier, and the UFC went for the more entertaining, more profitable options. So, was UFC 293 a meritocracy? No, it wasn't. It was picking and choosing the more profitable option, and Israel Adesanya did put his weight on that decision. Moving on to the next one. UFC 294. Islam Makhachev versus Alexander Volkanovski. Now, it should have been Charles Oliveira, so again, there was another late pullout, but Mateusz Gamrot was promised to be the backup for that fight, and instead they went with Islam Makhachev. Instead they went with Alexander Volkanovski, last minute, 11 days notice, because that would have sold more pay-per-views than Islam Makhachev versus Mateusz Gamrot. So UFC 294, was meritocracy followed there, or was it the UFC putting their weight on what would have been the more profitable option? It was the UFC putting their weight on the more profitable option. That's 2 no's so far. UFC 294, no, not a meritocracy. UFC 293, no, not a meritocracy. Moving on, UFC 295, Aspinall versus Sergey. Yes, but. And also on UFC 295 was Yuri versus Alex 1. Let's talk about Aspinall versus Sergey. Yes, that was the right fight that should have happened at the time. That one was meant to be Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic, but Jon Jones pulled out with a chest injury, the one that he's still recovering from to this day. Now, I will say it has a but for me. This is the one where this was happening during the time where both Yuri Prochazka and Jamal Hill were actually sitting out and had vacated their own titles. So we had this habit happening in the UFC at the time where if a champion was going to be away from the title picture for a very long period of time, rather than just sitting on their belt and calling themselves the best, they would just give up the title so the division could move on, and the UFC would reward them later on with a title shot when they came back. So with Aspinall versus Sergey Spivak, I'm going to give it a no, because that should have been for an undeserved title shot. I mean, we had Yuri versus Alex happening on that card because Yuri was coming back off his devastating injury and the UFC were giving him a title shot. So if we were keeping the same energy that was happening in the light heavyweight division, we should have kept that same energy for the heavyweight division. So Aspinall versus Sergey should have been for an undisputed title shot. And Yuri versus Alex, I completely understand. That one is a yes. 100% that one is a yes. So far you have got 3 no's, 1 yes. Now you have UFC 296. This one is getting 1 yes and 1 no. Edwards versus Colby Covington is the biggest example of a no. Colby Covington didn't deserve a title shot. Obviously not. And then you have Pantoja versus Royval. Totally fine. No's at the 4, yeses at the 3. UFC 297, Strickland versus DDP. This one is a 100% great decision by the UFC. This one is a complete meritocracy. DDP had knocked out Robert Whittaker. Sean Strickland had defeated Israel Adesanya. That one is completely okay. The second fight, I'm not even going to cover because that is WMMA. Let's focus on MMMA, or MMA original flavor, as I like to call it. So the UFC is starting to catch up with their perfectly legitimate and deserved title shots. It is now 4 for the no undeserves, 3 for the yes deserves, coming in at the start of the year of 2024. Moving on to UFC 298. Was Alexander Volkanovski versus Ilia Topuria? I'm going to give this one a no, and this one might be a little bit controversial. Let me know about it down there in the comments, but I do feel like Ilia Topuria was being protected from Max Holloway. While Max Holloway was being kept busy with the Korean Zombie retirement, and the UFC desperately wanted to have someone else fight Alexander Volkanovski, not named Max Holloway, because Max Holloway had his ass beaten to death, near death, by Alexander Volkanovski in their previous fight, and Alexander Volkanovski versus Max Holloway 4 was going to be a very hard sell. But the problem was Holloway kept killing off all of Volkanovski's contenders. He was so good, just not good enough to beat Volk at the time. So it wasn't really the true competitive landscape of MMA playing out. If it was the true competitive landscape of MMA playing out, there's a chance that you would have had Max Holloway versus Alexander Volkanovski 4, but instead the UFC decided to tiptoe Ilia Topuria around Holloway and get him a title shot against Volkanovski. So I'm going to give this one a no, and that might be controversial, but that's just my opinion on it. Trying to be as fair as I can. That's 5 no's, 4 yeses. UFC 299 is O'Malley versus Vera. Clearly, Vera only got a storyline shot at O'Malley because he was O'Malley's only official loss. Merab Dvalishvili was ready to go. They didn't give him a title shot. That is 100% the UFC picking the more profitable option. That's 6 no's, 4 yeses going into UFC 300. Now, this one is hard one, right? For the UFC 300 main event, Jamal Hill versus Alex Pereira. It should have been Magomed, but the UFC did the right thing by Jamal Hill, because Jamal Hill vacated because he was injured, and it's only fair that you reward Jamal Hill with a title shot when he comes back, and imply that the number 1 title contender, Magomed Ankalaev, gets another shot at the light heavyweight title after that has been contested between those two. But that is not happening now. Magomed Ankalaev has been booked for 2 weeks after Khalil Rountree versus Alex Pereira. So it sort of puts a blemish on what happened at UFC 300, because it was a gentleman's agreement that Alex and Jamal are going to do this, and then after that's done, Magomed, you get your shot. And that hasn't happened at all. So I'm going to give the UFC a yes for this, but it's a dodgy yes, because Magomed deserves a title shot. So it's 6 no's, 5 yeses, 1 of those yeses being iffy. Right? Now, moving on to UFC 301. Steve Erceg versus Alexandre Pantoja. I'm giving this a straight up no. Look, it was Steve Erceg's 4th fight in the UFC. Alexander Pantoja had fought most of the people in his division, and they just didn't want to do a rematch with someone else. They were looking for anybody else new. So they just kept going down the rankings until they found somebody else new. If it was truly the spirit of competition, it would have been a rematch with somebody further down the rankings. So UFC 301 gets a straight up, no, this wasn't a meritocracy. This wasn't the spirit of competition playing out. It was the UFC weighing in on how they wanted to sell UFC 301. So going into UFC 302, we have the same thing. We have the same thing, right? How could Gamrot be the backup at UFC 294, right? Not have lost a fight and not be the next one up. The UFC made a marketing decision, okay? It wasn't a true title fight. Yes, Islam Makhachev versus Dustin Poirier was fun. Yes, it was competitive, but I don't understand how you, and I don't like Mateusz Gamrot. If you've been watching the channel for a while, you know that. But I don't understand how you can make Mateusz Gamrot the backup, which means you're the next one in. If anything happens between these two, you're the next one in. He doesn't lose a fight. Then UFC 302 rolls around 6 months later. The champ needs someone to fight, and instead the UFC go with somebody else coming off one win, Dustin Poirier. That is the UFC picking and choosing who is going to sell more pay-per-views, not the spirit of competition playing out. That's 7 no's to the UFC, 5 yeses, one of those yeses being a little bit tainted and spoilt because now Magomed Ankalaev is being dogged. UFC 303, Pereira versus Yuri again. Again, Magomed Ankalaev is being denied a title shot here at UFC 303, and the marketing team is carrying this win off Yuri Prochazka's win over Alexander Rakic. The idea that Magomed Ankalaev isn't available to fight in America is ridiculous, as we have photos of him sitting in the front row at UFC events in America. It is no for this one. That's 8 no's, 5 yeses for the UFC. UFC 304, Bilal versus Edwards. Yes, this is a true yes, a massive yes. This is one of the 2 big yeses for me. You got Strickland versus DDP in this one. These are the obvious, clear-cut meritocracy decisions by the UFC, but they can never have a good time without spoiling it somehow, because you have Tom Aspinall versus Curtis Blades on the same title, and that's an interim title. When has a interim title holder ever defended the belt? That should not happen. I don't care if it's happened before. It shouldn't happen. You shouldn't have an interim title holder defending a belt, especially after we have had great examples like Yuri and Hill vacating their title because of inactivity. So you're getting a no for this one as well, UFC 304. You're getting 1 yes, 1 no. That's 9 no's, 6 yeses, and one of those yeses is a little bit tainted. Now we move on to UFC 305. No. Should have been Strickland or Whittaker. Israel Adesanya got yet another title shot after not fighting a single contender. He got given another title shot because of how much the UFC pay him and because he looks great on the front of the UFC video game cover. That is why he got his title shot. They were hoping that he was going to win that one. And now we are going to see who is going to sell more. Is it going to be Robert Whittaker? No. Is it going to be Sean Strickland? Yes. Is it going to be Khamzat Chimaev? Yes. That is how the UFC picks their title contender. So, tallying it all up, now that we are in the UFC TKO era, there is a more than likely chance that the next title challenger is going to be whoever makes the most money for the UFC, and the UFC is clearly not a meritocracy, with the final scorecard coming in as 10 no's, 6 yeses, one of those 6 yeses being dodgy because it implied that Magomed Ankalaev would have another go at the title. And he still has not been booked in to fight Alex Pereira, with the UFC's mouthpiece, Daniel Cormier, literally saying, you do not do that fight unless you have no other option. They are protecting Alex Pereira. The UFC picture, the UFC title picture, is not a meritocracy. Now, if you want to watch MMA as a meritocracy, go watch the PFL. You'll have a great time. I'll wake you up when the card's over. But stop complaining that the UFC is the ultimate fighting circus. You should know what it is by now. It's been a year. Here's the maths. Here's the scorecard. It's been tallied up. If you continue to watch the UFC in 2025, you are making an unwritten agreement that you know what is happening now. There's no more pretending like you don't know what's happening. If you're watching the UFC in 2025 and not the PFL, you're choosing to watch a little bit, not scripted, but pushed along version of MMA compared to a purest form of MMA, which is the PFL, and quite frankly, horrible to watch. It's so boring. That's it for this video. Let me know, do you think I was too harsh on the UFC? Do you think I was fair? Do you think I wasn't harsh enough? Put it down there in the comments. If you enjoy it, make sure to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. If you're already subscribed, if you could hit the like button, that would be massive. Helps push these videos out to a newer audience. And until then, I will catch you all in the next video.